So I mentioned this idea of the polycrisis or the permacrisis or all of these sorts of things. And obviously there is, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm reading, The Age of Catastrophe, The New Age of Catastrophe by Alex Kalinikos at the moment. And everywhere you look, there seems to be a crisis. So I'll just quickly outline a little bit of what Kalinikos says. And then, we could talk about particularly Adam Tooze, who's he hasn't quite trademarked the idea of polycrisis, but certainly he's probably the foremost thinker of it. So this, I think, is a fairly, perhaps standard, almost Marxist account that Kalinikos would give. He would say, well, you have these different levels of society: the biological, which involves productive forces, labor process, and the metabolism of nature through labor. You have the economic. This is relations of production, and this is the capital labor on one side and different capitals on another side, so exploitation and competitive accumulation. Geopolitical is the level of imperialism. Political crisis, which is, he says, it's the crisis of the extreme center and the rise of the far right. May or may not agree with that. And then finally the ideological, and he says that you have race, gender, and race and gender as the terrains of contestation. And his point would be, well, the kind of the polycrisis, this is a liberal view because you have these external shocks to the system, and that's how it works itself through. But the Marxist approach would be, well, no, it's a catastrophe rather than a crisis because it's something to do with the internal logic of the system. It's not like accidental. It's not like contingent. It's not like things could be otherwise. It's always going to be like this. So that's the distinction between crisis and catastrophe. I mean, is Kalinikos fair on Tooze there, or is it a bit more complicated than that in the idea of polycrisis?
I think polycrisis is, I think it's a slightly, I think it tells us more about the people kind of making the designation than it does perhaps about about the world itself. And it has that kind of Toozian, I think it has that Toozian quality of drawing these kind of dazzling connections between different domains, geographically, economically, politically, sociologically, and suggesting there, implying that there is some kind of profound connection. But rather than the connection being premised on a kind of underlying substantive theoretical logical relationship, it's more a kind of a relationship which is posited on the basis of the knowledge of the person making the claim, Adam Tooze, to be fair to him, is entitled to draw those kinds of connections. But unfortunately, many people who kind of the Toozians, who kind of, or his followers, are perhaps, in a less strong position to make those kinds of connections. So it goes something like, there is like a crisis in, Argentine grain production that will have knock-on consequences for Ukraine's exports, which will have knock-on consequences for Russia, which will have knock-on consequences for the price of oil, which will have knock-on consequences for the global biosphere. And this all connects to like the election of a new, kind of populist figure in Argentina you've never heard of. It's this kind of drawing connections from assimilating and synthesizing a tremendous body of knowledge. So it's very much connected to a particular kind of model of erudition, I think, and it's very much connected to the internet age of thinking in those kinds of hyperlinked terms. But it's not really, doesn't really amount to a kind of a theory that relates these levels in a kind of systematic and structured way. And so I think that's the difference between the model of the kind of the polycrisis and legitimation crisis, or earlier kind of Marxist accounts of crisis, however you might want to frame them. So I think that, that's an important distinction. And so when people look at the world and they see polycrisis, I think what they see is like a world which is, perhaps, which is shifting and changing in ways that might not be amenable to traditional modes of intervention or response. And it seems deeply threatening, but it doesn't seem to me a kind of a theoretical account in the same league.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Phil. That's well put. And I want to build on that because my notes kind of ran along similar lines. I I think too, as you say, Tooze is very good at this and be able to draw those connections. And I think it's also a contribution of Marxism, or kind of a characteristic of kind of Marxian thought, that things are connected, unlike liberalism, which hives things off into different arena. Like politics has nothing to do with economics has nothing to do with society, has nothing to do with culture, and a kind of a key element, I think, of the dialectical, of thinking of society dialectically, is that these things are all connected. So in that regard, Polycrisis seems good because it draws on that. But I think the reason it's popular is because we have no meta narratives. It's the world seems all very confusing and falling apart, and all these kind of crazy turbulent things are happening. In the past, you would have been able to say, well, it's capitalism that is the crisis, or some kind of being able to kind of reduce it to some kind of unique factor, which explains why the world is chaotic. Because it's important to remember that capitalist modernity is turbulence. It is crisis ridden. So it's not just like today we have more crises. I mean, this is a kind of feature of modernity. All discussions of modernity have seized on this fact that the world is thrown upside down every single day, and it's very chaotic and confusing. That is the nature of modernity. But why? But in previous eras, there were meta narratives which allowed people to explain it, to say it's capitalism, or it is bureaucratization, or it is whatever, the various different. So I'm not going to go through all the possibilities of social theory, but they basically explain logically what it is that underpins all this, what makes the system work. And I think Polycrisis evades that and just kind of goes, well, there's just stuff going on everywhere, and tries to, as Phil said, through erudition, trying to go and connect all these things. I think this kind of underscores that we have today modernity without enlightenment. You have all the turbulence of modernity, but without the intellectual ambition and even disposition to see things systematically and through kind of to tell a grand story about how the world works. And so you end up with something like Polycrisis. I also think, as a second point, and I'll stop there, is that there's a political use to it, that Polycrisis is put to, and it's why kind of like the World Economic Forum adopts it. But we'll come to that in a second. Go ahead, George.
No, I was just going to agree with the two of you. It seems like polycrisis is a very useful concept for a world that doesn't have a model of society, or a Marxist model of society. So things are connected to each other, but there is some kind of probably vague understanding. Sorry, not in Adam Tooze's case, but in maybe some people who use this concept a bit more indiscriminately, that political economy is somehow very, very important. But there's no kind of even a basic kind of that kind of base and superstructure type model, I wouldn't say, in that concept. Instead, it's a very good concept for a kind of, in some ways, a kind of flattened model of society, and a kind of FT view of the world, where there is clearly political economy is there and world events happen, but do you have that underlying reservoir of like all of these models of society or rationalization?
And it doesn't just need to
whatever.
be it doesn't just need to be Marxist. I think even a kind of Christian conservative might have said, in the 1960s, like an age of, which was understood at the time as being like an age of crisis, been able to provide some sort of answer as to why this is happening, right? Not just be like, oh, it's polycrisis, but say like, well, it's because we've forgotten God, or we've abandoned deference,
Yeah, there is
whatever.
There is something about that. Without the meta narratives, without like all the different competing individual gods, you just have the pantheon comes back in a way, and so you have all the little crisis gods that you have the little shrines to. Maybe, I don't know, whatever.
An activist view of the world. Yeah, no, but I think there's one other I think intellectual route to kind of polycrisis type of thinking, and I think that's ecology and risk. And you can refer to the work of like Ulrich Beck around kind of risk society, which underpins a lot of this, I think, whether explicitly or implicitly, more likely, which is that the society is understood kind of ecologically in terms of feedback loops, in terms of interventions which have a certain degree of risk, which bear with them, which can explode in your face. And then this causes, you kill off all the frogs, and then there's no one eating the flies. And then because there's no flies, the spiders go hungry, and then there's no webs, which means there's no blah, 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 et cetera, right? It's like kind of an ecological conception of the world where risk, it plays a very important part. And like the old homeostasis has been broken up. Now, what's interesting is that ecological vision of society gets parlayed into this polycrisis idea. Polycrisis itself talks about constantly about how climate interacts with economy, interacts with politics, which it does. I don't want to say that kind of the natural environment is completely separate from society. We that isn't the case. But I think the issue is more the first thing I was talking about, which is that intellectually there's no really true social understanding. It's an ecological understanding of society, which I think is the part of the problem of the polycrisis understanding of things.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. The contemporary kind of understanding of crisis is one that's very close to risk, disaster management, that sort of thing, risk and disaster reduction, all those sorts of things. That's like a very, we can mitigate, we can have a kind of a risk and crisis register and have all of our mitigating actions and reduce the impact of all of these things. That kind of very, that's a,
but also resilience, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Like the resilient. Yeah, the resilient kind of actor, resilient network, resilient institution, resilient society has already kind of preemptively absorbed the possibilities of all of these shocks and changes. And therefore there is actually, in a sense, it's kind of, there's no need to, to actually deal with them at source, or to kind of mount any or to make an effort at any qualitative, systemic or radical transformation, because resilience has been built in. Responsiveness and adaptation has already been built into the system.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's responding to the continual crises rather than doing something proactive about it, because who wouldn't want to be more resilient? If there's too many fires, just toughen up your skin and become fireproof, that sort of thing.
But that's it. It's always tacit. Like, how do we return to the old homeostasis, right? Like in this kind of more ecological model of society, things were in balance. Now, because there's been interventions of different sort, things are out of whack. And so you have a polycrisis where things are compounding on another, and we just need to keep this plate spinning and equilibrate things. There's it's not like society's dynamic and historical, progressing through time, but also achieving progress, social progress, moral progress, where in the old conception, you would have the old kind of modernist conception, you'd have progress and you would have crises, which then be overcome. And through the overcoming of that crisis, you're led to a higher stage of society, a better society. And that doesn't need to be a Marxist or socialist conception. It could well be a liberal one of various stripes. And that isn't on the cards. There's no conception of crisis. It's more just let's manage the polycrisis to attenuate it, to build resilience, so we can, the spaceship which is flying through this crazy world can just kind of keep from tipping over. But there's no sense of progress there. You're not achieving anything. You're not moving on to a new stage.
Well, hello, listener. I hope you like what you're hearing. It's a short excerpt from an episode that's available only to subscribers. Want to support BungaCast and get at least 2 original episodes a month? Sign up at patreon.com/BungaCast right now. $5 a month patrons get access to exclusive episodes like our in-depth analyses of present history. The big stuff that's happening right now. As well as chats with our regular guests, extended interviews with the key thinkers trying to understand our world today, and much more. For $10 a month, you join the BungaCast Reading Club, the place for those of us who are serious about equipping ourselves with the necessary intellectual tools for understanding the world and seeking to change it. Phil, George, and myself, Alex, look forward to seeing you there. Patreon.com/BungaCast.